settle. Quiet, please. Go ahead. Why don't you tell us your name and what your role is in the university?
Okay. My name is George Handley. I've been teaching at BYU since 1998 in the Department of Humanities, Classics, and Comparative Literature. I've served as the coordinator for Latin American Studies and also section head for the Humanities program. So, in various committee work at the university.
And your research interests?
My research is focused on two things. I'm a comparatist by training. I do comparative literature of the Americas, so Caribbean, Latin American, and U.S. literary studies. And then I also work in the field of eco-criticism, which is literature in the environment and environmental values in literature, and also religion in the environment. So.
And the classes you teach?
Well, in our department in the humanities, our classes range from the survey, Western Humanities survey courses, Introduction to the Humanities. I teach those classes. I also teach a theory class, and then we have seminar topics, and that's when I get to do environmental humanities or comparative courses on the Americas.
I explained to you a little bit, and the email that we sent to you explained something about the area we want to have you talk about, and then I explained to you a little bit about what we want to do. Are you comfortable with having us use comments you'd make here on a website or in workshop or other kinds of settings?
Yeah, I'm comfortable having you use what I say for whatever educational purposes. That's fine.
We gave you a list of quotes that were it's in this ballpark. Would you like to start with one of those quotes? Have you thought about taking one of those as a launching point, or would you like me to? I've also reviewed some things you said in the focus group and have some specific questions for you.
Well, why don't you go ahead? Maybe if you just go ahead with the specific questions.
George, you're one of a number of faculty we've talked with in the past about having classroom experiences and interactions with faculty that are both intellectually enlarging and spiritually strengthening. And your students are particularly excited, enthusiastic about what you do to combine those aspects. To what do you attribute their response to you and to your classes? How would you explain this sense that they report of your classes, your interactions being both spiritually strengthening and intellectually enlarging to them?
I don't know how to explain why students might be particularly enthusiastic about that combination of intellectual stimulation and spiritual growth in my classes, but I do think, I think I have a particular passion for BYU because I didn't go here. I did take a semester here as an undergraduate, but I graduated and did all of my undergraduate and graduate schooling in California in the Bay Area, and so I didn't realize actually until I was done with graduate school just how limiting that experience had been spiritually, at least in terms of the opportunity to explore the intellectual grounds for my spiritual life. I mean, I had sort of by a strategy of survival learned to keep those two somewhat separate. And I taught for 3 years at Northern Arizona University before coming here, but when I came here, it really just felt like the floodgates had been opened up, and I had every reason and excuse to be able to explore things spiritual and intellectual at the same time in my classes. So I suppose it just sort of happens naturally for me that when I'm discussing some topic, I try to. I'm always sort of thinking as a Mormon. I don't think when I'm asking students to understand, say, a philosopher who doesn't share LDS values or is just who he or she might be as a thinker, and I want to make sure they understand that thinker on their own terms. I really push that. I do think that's very important. But at the same time, at some point, the students, I assume and often find out that they are asking questions about how to think through some of those issues. And so I sort of try to do that. I think maybe too I'm particularly sensitive to the fact that students get lost at BYU, both while they're here and maybe after they graduate. I've been here long enough to have seen the trajectory of some of the students that I've taught and seen some of them leave the church, or some of them very unhappy at BYU for maybe personal reasons or a variety of reasons, but we sort of assume that everyone's being taken care of at BYU, and I'm finding that's not always the case. So I think that too drives a little bit of what I do. I'm sort of looking for ways to strengthen students. So some of that is not necessarily even part of the classroom experience. It might be that when I'm with a student in my office or in a mentoring situation or another, say on a hike or a field trip or something, I try to put my radars on and listen for evidence that maybe somebody's struggling in some way and try to build them up.
There are two or three things I'd like to follow up with you in that regard. But let me just stay with the developmental journey for a minute and your sense of that it was limiting for you to be in the Bay Area, in a place where you couldn't bring your spiritual, religious life into the conversation particularly. Was it helpful to you to developmentally to be required to look at these theorists that you were reading, these literary stars, whatever, on their own terms, and try to understand them from their perspective, rather than having had the gospel perspective as part of the conversation?
That's a really good question. The benefit of learning writers and thinkers, learning their ideas on their own terms, is that there's a certain amount of intellectual honesty that requires, right? And I do think there are many times in classroom situations where students are too eager to jump away from the content of a particular thinker or writer because they want to be at home base, they want to be on gospel turf, and they're not comfortable thinking in a new way and in a different way. And that was really hammered into me as an undergraduate at Stanford University. I had a professor my freshman year who knew I was LDS and probably didn't want me to go on a mission, probably didn't really particularly care for my religious life, but he respected it enough. And I remember he just repeatedly would say, you just need to make sure you're understanding these writers on their own terms. And that was good enough for him, and that was good for me. So I do think that's really important. This is a kind of a double-edged sword, because it's easy to water down the intellectual struggle that students need to go through, at least speaking in the humanities. I'm sure there are comparable issues in different fields, but I think that's really crucial. And they need to see you modeling that. They need to see you thinking like the person you're reading, and helping them think like that person. But I think at some point I try to make sure the students know I'm wearing a hat at one point, and then I'm myself a little bit more, and I'm more personal, and I'm more the religious person I am as well, so that they can check in there and see how I think about things. But if I can model for them both being a Christian, and because I'm a Christian, I try to say this very explicitly to my students, because I'm a Christian, it's my duty to listen. It's my duty to really understand. And so I can't judge right away. I can't jump to conclusions, and I can't be afraid. fear is a really counterproductive learning attitude. And so I say, I have to do this out of love, even if it feels a little bit uncomfortable as I'm listening to an idea and thinking it through. And the good news that I try to tell them is that very often on the other end of the experiment, you find out that an idea that you thought was pretty threatening is not actually all that threatening because you misunderstood it, or you didn't understand the full life story or the full context out of which those ideas came. And when you get that perspective, suddenly the gospel starts to look bigger and more interesting and more rich. So that I try to insist to the students is again, your Christian duty is to try to amplify, right? Lay hold of every good thing, as Mormon says. So you really have to be about the business of seeking out the good, no matter where it might be. But at the same time, coming to BYU, if I can express my opinion, I'm a little disappointed in the fact that more BYU faculty aren't taking more advantage of the environment here. I think there's too much of, at least in some of the circles I run in, there's too much suspicion that if we mix too much religion into the classroom, we're watering things down intellectually, as we were just describing. And I think you can do both. I think you can be rigorous and demanding of students and yet also spiritually fulfilling. And I actually just recently had some conversations with some students, and it was not a good report. I mean, a lot of them felt uncertain about the faith of their professors, uncertain about how the gospel might fit with some of the things they were learning in those classes. And I thought, and I'll tell you, the one thing that I really intellectually feel robbed of from my education at Stanford and at Berkeley is that there is a tremendously rich intellectual tradition that is religiously based, that has been going on since time immemorial, and certainly going on through the 20th century, which was not the story I got. And I'm wondering why we're not exposing our students more to more of that kind of thinking. And I feel like I've had to sort of retrain and go back and read more widely to complement or supplement the education I received, because the education I received basically was a narrative moving towards increasing secularization and the assumption that faith really was not reconcilable with intellectual life. And I think most of us at BYU were trained at universities that teach that way. And so there's a little bit of either an inferiority complex or a wound that some of us maybe carry around, where we're a little bit embarrassed about our faith, and I think sometimes that gets communicated to the students, and I think that's a real mistake. I don't by the same token mean that we should be constantly pulling out the gospel trump card and say, see, everything. I mean, I think there are a lot of issues that are hard, and maybe another thing that we can model as professors is patience and faith, right? I mean, if students see that that the intellectual questions do not have to be tied to lifestyle. In other words, I can still do my home teaching, I can still keep the word of wisdom, I can pay my tithing, I can go to church on Sunday. Those things don't have to be affected by whether or not I've resolved my questions about evolution or about homosexuality or about whatever other issues there might be. These things need to be thought through, but they don't have to immediately affect our ability to keep the commandments. And I find that to be one of the strangest and most disappointing decisions when I see students or colleagues or friends who run into intellectual problems and think that suddenly has to impinge on how they live their life. And I think so what I want to say is that if students can see a professor whose lifestyle is grounded in the gospel and grounded in the commandments, and yet they see that kind of intellectual honesty and openness and questioning, that I think is really a powerful combination. Even when a professor can't answer all the questions, even if I have to say to my students, I don't know how to reconcile that one. That one's a tough one. And I'm still working on that, and this is what I'm reading, and this is what I'm thinking lately. But it's not going to affect the way I live my life.
I remember you citing Elder Holland talking about parenting and talking about the fundamentals. I'd love to hear you talk about how you use his approach, whether you become a devil's advocate for a while as you wear a hat, maybe even model an example of working through an issue from what you're doing to follow on from Elder Holland's statement. You remember the one I've heard you cite on several occasions, actually.
Yeah, Elder.
What you? Did you?
Elder Holland said that.
Hang on just one second.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's a comment he made, Elder Holland made about parenting that's really influenced me, where he said, and I don't have the quote in front of me, so I'm not going to remember it word for word, but to the effect that there are a few fundamentals of the gospel that are kind of that they're vitally important that parents communicate to the children that they know things that they know, and they have to do with Jesus Christ as our Savior and Redeemer, and the restoration of the gospel, the translation of the Book of Mormon, the restoration of the priesthood. Those are pretty small, and it's not a long list of things that we should be very clear and unambiguous about. But beyond that, I remember him saying there's a lot of room for discussion and for debate and for exploration in the gospel, and as long as those foundations are strong, then I think we're actually more free in some ways to do that kind of exploration with students, because they feel like they know where home base is. They do feel like there's some kind of anchor to their exploration, but I think they get nervous when they feel like they're being pulled this way and that. I mean, on the other hand, I suppose there are times in class when I will assume the position of a writer we're reading. They start disagreeing with the writer, and I'll start disagreeing with them. I think, like I said, I think they figure out, and I try to make it pretty clear. I don't try to confuse them. I'm speaking as Karl Marx right now, and this is what you're misunderstanding about me, or I'm speaking as Freud. But what about this? These are tough questions. This is a real issue. Don't gloss over this so quickly. I think students need that. I think that's really important in the classroom setting, that they're pushed that way intellectually, so that they're, again, really listening and understanding thought on its own terms before they jump to broader conclusions. I mean, I think it's important to stress to them that you're just really just beginning a long journey, and even after you're done, you won't really have scratched the surface of this thinker. I mean, there might be thinkers they read as a freshman in, say, a Western humanities class, like Karl Marx. They never read him again. It's not like they're going to go on and study economics and economic theory and master that kind of stuff. So it's even more dangerous for them to jump to really flippant, quick conclusions based on an excerpt from an anthology. But my former dean, Van Gessel, said something very similar to what Elder Holland said when I was first hired. He just said, your students need to know where your fundamental commitments lie, and if they have that clearly in their sights, then they're much more likely to trust you and go with you where you need to take them. And I find that really true, because it is, there are students who will dig in their heels in a kind of panic that something really crucial is at stake for them, and I've got to convince them that there's a play of the mind, an exercise of thought that doesn't have to challenge those things. And again, it's not about how you live your life. I mean, I might be wrong on this, but I often think we think too much about the importance of thinking correctly, when in fact it seems to me that Christ's teachings focused much more on acting correctly, or being good, right, rather than being right. And so I think we can relax a little bit when we're engaged in intellectual discussion, whether it's about politics or about social issues or about intellectual ideas and philosophies. I think we need an atmosphere where that can be much more free, but that won't work if we're not really clearly anchored at the same time in how we're asked to live our lives by the Savior. That seems to be paramount. And again, if students can't sense that that's what guides you, then they're not going to trust all of that intellectual work that you want to do with them.
Can you think of ways you specifically help them be assured of where you stand?
Well, I try to help students know where I stand by sometimes being a little more personal with them. I didn't used to do that. I was asked once after 2 or 3 years teaching here. I remember doing an informal mid-semester survey of the class to find out how students were liking the class and what they wanted to see improved. And one student said, "Tell us more about yourself." And I still try, by nature, don't really feel terribly comfortable doing that. But I thought, well, okay, if the occasion permits, I should tell a spiritual experience, or I should tell a personal story so that they can see into my heart a little bit. I think you can't really teach students effectively if they don't have a relationship with you of some kind. You can't be best friends with every student, and there's only so much you can do. But if you, to the degree that I've been able to have one-on-one encounters with students, either because they're my research assistant or because they're helping me with a project, or they've come to me to direct an honors thesis, or if nothing else, I'm on a field trip, I'm on a hike. I try to occasionally have students over to my house to watch a film that we might be viewing for class, but instead of having them see it on campus, I'll have them, I only live a mile away, so it's convenient. They can even walk to my house. But if just a little bit of that, and of course the study abroad programs I've found just tremendous that way because of the relationships you can strike up with students. If they can just get a little bit of a glimpse into your life, then it opens up a lot more possibilities. That has to be done with some care, but I do think a kind of cold, professional classroom appearance that never extends a hand of friendship to students on any level makes it very hard for a student to respond to the whole person. The student might respond pretty well to the classroom experience and to maybe even the intellectual dimension of what the classroom experience is trying to provide, but the spiritual aspect seems to suffer as a result. But I would go so far as to argue that I think even the intellectual dimensions of a classroom experience suffer if there's not a relationship of some kind with students. They need to feel like you're an ally or you're open to them. It's hard because there's so many students and they demand so much of your time, but I think if you can incorporate into classroom experiences, into the syllabus, activities that get students out of the classroom a little bit, that's really helpful.
For example?
Well, I don't have in the humanities the benefit of, say, a lab where we're going to spend lots of hours together in a lab setting. But I try always to have some kind of a field trip or hike. Some of that might even not be formally scheduled into the syllabus. I'll just say, hey, I'm hiking up Rock Canyon on Friday morning. Anyone want to come with me? And I'll get a small group to go up with me or something like that. But like I say, watching films at my house. I've done service projects in classes. I've found that my research is really useful in being in the position to have more one-on-one mentoring relationships with students, because sometimes students come to my office without being in a class of mine, but they know about my research, so they want to talk to me about it, or maybe they're feeling the situation out to see if I want to be their advisor or something like that. But if there's I've just found that my research interests and projects have enabled me to mentor a lot of students that I never actually had in class. And that I've really, really enjoyed. I mean, I almost enjoy that more than the classroom interaction.
What's interesting to me, George, is that many of the things you're talking about as ways of building a relationship happen outside of the classroom context. You almost have to design ways to get outside the classroom. And yet I am assuming you teach some fairly large sections of humanities. What do you do in a large class setting where you to build a relationship with students of where you got 80 students or maybe more?
Yeah. Well, I have never taught a class over 80, so I can't speak to that. We do have some sections in our department that are 250 or so, and I don't know how that would work. I think it's also the persona that you present in class. I mean, I can't speak out of direct experience, but if I had a class that's so large, I mean, I've come close to 80. I think I had a class that was about 75. And I think some of that's also just, if you're willing to tell a few anecdotes and a few stories about yourself. I have a colleague in my department who's a master at that. I mean, he tells very endearing, funny stories about his family. Or it doesn't take a lot of class time to do that, but I try to sprinkle the personal into my lecturing to some degree, so that they feel like they can see the person. That may be the minimal that you could do under a situation like that. But they might. It still might spark enough of an interest in a student that in another opportunity, in another class, or because of a research project they take up, they might come to you. I don't. There's no evidence of this at all, but I want to believe that passion for teaching helps overall. Just the fact that I'm enthusiastic and excited about what I'm doing and what I'm talking about, that students feel there's a little bit of contagion that happens, and they're sparked by that, and that comes from my heart. It doesn't come from my head. It really has to do with the fact that I guess I'm a passionate person about everything almost, and so that I think helps to open up that door a little bit.
I'm hearing a couple of things. One is, are you accessible? Are you somebody they can understand as a whole person? Do they see your passion for the subject for them? And that somehow that connects to understanding where you stand with respect to the atonement and the restoration and keeping the commandments. Do you see a direct connection there? Is it conscious for you as you're sharing anecdotes that they're somehow about revealing that part of you, the fundamentals part of you?
Yeah, I think that's it's very important that the personal aspects of your life that you're sharing in class, to the degree that you choose to do that, are well selected. I do think, I can't speak out of, it's not like I've sat in on other professors' classes and compared notes extensively on this particular question, but I worry on my own that if I'm going to spend the time in class, which is very limited, to share something personal, it better be relevant to either the class lesson that day or spiritually relevant in some way. If it's just to magnify myself in their eyes, then that's wrong. And that's a great temptation, I think, for being in front of a group of students, to try to inflate yourself in front of them and entertain them in some way. And I think I try. I mean, I don't know that I always succeed. I have had students comment that sometimes he goes off on anecdotes and I never quite I mean, I'm going to get that, but most of the time students have told me that they appreciate the things that I've said, because I try to be selective. I try to say, okay, is this, and I don't want to sound overly sanctimonious about it, but I try to let the Spirit guide me, and if I feel impelled to share something, I'm going to share it, and I have felt the opposite. I've felt the impressions that I had to just keep my mouth shut and go on with the lesson and not say something because it's something else is motivating me, and I don't want that to get in the way. But I think you can do it. I think but a lot of this, it's not about. This has to be who you are. I mean, you can't fake this. You can't pretend to be a religious person if you're not. You can't pretend to be passionate about the gospel if you're not. And if it's not a central part of your life, then you're not going to be able to do this in the classroom. So there is also that question that I always have to go back to when I'm not in class or when I'm not on campus, when I'm at home and going to the temple or whatever, or going to church and saying, am I who I want to be? Am I square with God? Am I passionate about Him? Do I feel His love? Am I close enough to Him? And there are plenty of times when I have to say, no, I'm not. I need to fix things, and it's affecting the way I teach. It affects everything. It affects the way I parent. It affects the way I interact with my colleagues. So to the degree that I come out of a classroom experience dissatisfied, for me, I could go to the pedagogy stuff, but for me, it's go back to like praying a little more intently. To be honest, I cut a lot of corners when it comes to class prep. I'm not a master at that. I mean, that's probably my greatest weakness. I'm very improvisational, and I'm very busy. So I often feel like I've felt some guilt over the years about I'm probably not preparing for class as well as I should. But for me, when things feel right spiritually, I've got the stuff in my head. I can teach if I'm right with God, But if I'm not right with God, then things come out really scattered. So I think that's really important.
I want to kind of pull you back and pull a couple of things together. It felt like some of your colleagues that you were hearing students talk about were worried about students not getting in, and you too, getting into the thinker, the background, really being rigorous intellectually. Some were pulling back as a result on the religious part. You're saying, no, I need to make sure that's clear, but I want to make sure they explore the intellectual part so they don't too quickly, prematurely dismiss a thinker from whom they might learn a lot, and a lot that would be compatible with the gospel. I want to now turn it back to what the other concern you had was about students who were so lost in the thinker or in coming up with a different conclusion than somebody else about evolution or about homosexuality or whatever it was, that they get lost. Some are hanging on to their testimony and not allowing them to learn. Some are letting go of their testimony. And what do you do with them? How do you recognize that that's going on? What is it? How do you deal with that side of the spiritual and intellectual integration?
Well, it's hard to know what causes a student to lose their faith. It often might appear that it has something to do with intellectual curiosity gone in the wrong direction or too extreme or something. I'm pretty suspicious that that's usually not the root cause. I served as a campus bishop for 3 years, and it was very interesting to see sort of both angles of a student's life and to see what was going on emotionally, spiritually, personally in students' lives. And of course, I now have a daughter at BYU, and I know her life story pretty well, and I know enough students well enough to know that there are lots of issues circling around their lives that have nothing to do with what they're reading in a particular class. So I don't see that as a major component. I usually assume, and until I'm maybe corrected otherwise, that a struggle with faith can, for whatever reason that it was caused, it can be healed or at least helped by gospel living. I mean, that's always been my rule of thumb, and I try to say that to students. If things are getting murky and you're getting confused and you're feeling lost, there might be lots of causes for that, and they might go well beyond. They probably do go well beyond this classroom. But If you're taking care of your spiritual life, then you're going to have some aid and some support to get you through. I always like that image of the rod of iron actually passes through the mist of darkness. It doesn't get you around it. You're actually in it for quite a while. At least it sounds that way to me. Meaning you can't really see the end. You don't even know visually. You don't have any evidence that it's actually taking you where you want to go. You just have to act in faith, and you can't let go. If you let go, then it's a lot harder to find your way. So it's really basic things, to nourish themselves spiritually. So those might be the kind of anecdotes that maybe I'll share. I might talk about my own experiences reading the scriptures, or my own experiences on a mountaintop after a hike or something where I felt reassurance that God loved me, even though I still didn't have things intellectually resolved. But that gave me a sense of peace to go forward, and I think that's maybe the answer in a lot of ways. I think, speaking more broadly, I'm again speaking somewhat anecdotally, but I've known a lot of students who have left the church ostensibly over political and or intellectual issues. And those are real issues to them, and they're real issues in the world. They're to be dealt with and talked through. But I know a lot of people who wrestle with those same issues, who stay in the church and don't have answers necessarily, but they stay in faith, and they're nurtured by their faith. Their lives are a lot happier, a lot more grounded, with a lot more direction. And to me, there's always proof in the pudding. You live the gospel, and it gives you a kind of grounding that is tangible. And it doesn't provide. I sometimes chafe a little bit when people say, "Well, the gospel has all the answers." Well, yeah, it's got all the fundamental answers, but there's a lot of things we just don't know. And I think it's important that students learn to live with a little bit of uncertainty. If they feel like I have uncertainty, therefore I must change my lifestyle, or I must choose a different path. And no, you don't have. You can live with uncertainties. We all do. You can live with questions. We all have to. But there are certain things that, in my mind, you live a certain way, and there's direct fruit that comes from that kind of living that's tangible and real and grounded, and makes the journey through the mist of darkness a lot more interesting and less fearful.
Pretty thoughtful, George. I've been asking some questions and trying to pull out from what you've said, but also what I know you've said in the past. I may not have allowed you to say some things you wanted to say. You wanted to contribute to the conversation. Are there some things that I haven't asked you that I should have, or that you'd like to contribute?
Well, let me look. See if there was anything. Well, two thoughts that I had. One is that we just sort of finished talking a little bit about, but it weighs on my heart so much when I see students leave. And I don't always see it. Sometimes it happens after they're gone, but I can sort of feel it coming, and it just weighs me down. And I've actually met some of the parents of these students, and it's not that they're a problem. I think it's just sad to me that we aren't maybe we're not doing enough as an institution, as faculty members, to nurture this spiritual side of our students. I don't know. I just feel this anxiety about that, and I don't know that it makes all the difference, but it saddens me. It saddened me a great deal to have this recent conversation I had with some students, to hear that they really had taken a number of classes in their major and not really known where their professors stood spiritually. And I thought, really? You didn't even know if they had testimonies? And they said, honestly, We didn't know. And I think that's a problem. I really do. I hope that we're taking full advantage of the freedom that we have here to engage our students spiritually the way that we can. The other thing is that I maybe on a related note, I think there are a lot of minority students at BYU and maybe female students at BYU who really struggle feeling like they have permission to be excellent. For whatever reasons, they might be afraid to stick out, or they might feel like the university, just by virtue of the demographics, isn't primarily for them, it's primarily for somebody else. And those might be misperceptions, they might be unfair, but it's hard. I was a very, very small minority as a Mormon at Stanford and Berkeley, so I know what it feels like to be really outnumbered and to think no one else thinks this way or no one else has this life experience. But I really think that one of the things that professors can and should do at BYU is help students identify their purpose. You know, what is it that is unique about them that puts them in a position to be of unique service to the kingdom of God? What is it that they appear to have been shaped to do, and why are they here? I had this incredible experience as a incoming freshman to Stanford University, where I was one of 4 male Mormons who entered that year. I had grown up somewhat inactive and was really worried about, I was deciding between BYU and Stanford, and I was really worried that Stanford would mean, I wouldn't get the support that I needed spiritually. And after a lot of prayer and fasting, I decided to go to Stanford and felt good about it, but I still had some nervousness. And I was assigned to one of those 4 male Mormons as a roommate, and he had grown up with similar circumstances, with this similar anxiety, and had prayed similarly that if I'm going to go to Stanford, please help me be protected. I mean, they did not know we were Mormons when they assigned us together, because you don't mention your religion on your roommate card. And if that happens to me at Stanford, I mean, why should someone get lost at BYU? That's what worries me, and I think students, if they can gain the eyes to see it, they're being guided, they're being put in the right places, in the right classes, the right contacts, but they have to have eyes of faith to see that happening. And I think it's important that, again, through telling my own story and then helping them, hearing their story, and helping them to identify those markers of who they are and what they could do to be of service is really important. I think I told this story at the Faculty Center, but I had a student who is a daughter of a single mother from Colombia in an immigrant family. She's the first to go to college in her family, and she wants to go to medical school. And, once I heard just the basic components of her life story, just because she came in to talk to me about a paper she'd written, she wanted to do better on it, and here I was thinking the student was just coming in to complain about a grade, and she came in because she really wanted to learn. And when I got her whole sketch of her life story, I suddenly became her biggest fan. I'm like, I'm going to help you succeed. I'll do anything it takes. But once you hear that life, you can't know what you're dealing with if you don't give a student a chance to tell a little bit about themselves. That might be one other issue is writing assignments or other kinds of interviews where you can get a chance to just hear their basic story. I think is really valuable. But this was a student who needed to be told, as if she didn't know it, God put you here, and He's not going to let you down, and you've been shaped to be here and to do what you're going to do, and you're going to do great things, and I totally believe in you. That's all I said to her, and it bonded us together just because I said that to her. But I wouldn't have known to say that to her if I had never talked to her. So.
Great example. We have some more time. We've thought about 45 minutes. We could take more if you have more that you'd like to share. This has just been wonderful.
Oh, thanks.
I got you to say all that I
Yeah.
wanted. And
Well,
you
I
did
don't.
more
I
than
don't
that,
think.
and,
I don't.
Thank you very much. Just very thoughtful. Thanks for, I guess more than anything, who you are. I love that you're on the path, in the journey, holding on to the rod of iron. Love
Oh, thanks. Thanks. Well, it's a real privilege to be at BYU. I really do think that we haven't yet constructed the whole narrative that's necessary to shift education. And that sounds like a really grandiose statement, but I mean, I think I got 10 years of schooling in the Bay Area, and it was a great education.
Yeah.
But in so many ways, it was misleading and wrong about a lot of its assumptions, and I'd like to devote some energy to fixing that somehow, and we ought to be at the forefront of a lot of things that we're not. I mean, this is anecdotally, but we had a really well-known scholar in literature come to BYU several years ago. I think he's come a couple times now to the English department. He's an English scholar, but he happens to be married to a former Mormon, so he has Utah connections now, so he's coming out. And he's actually, I think, an atheist. I mean, he sort of said, well, sometimes I think I might be agnostic. But he said, why aren't you guys, this is very specific to English and literary studies, but he said, why aren't you guys, of all people, at the forefront of thinking about the theoretical dimensions of sacred texts and what it means to translate, or what it means to, I mean, he sort of made a list of things that he had gleaned just from knowing the basic Mormon story. He was kind of disappointed that we were just doing typical literary criticism like anybody else, undistinguishable from anything else at another university. And I thought that's a really serious reprimand, that we failed. We have not succeeded yet. I mean, we haven't failed because we haven't really tried yet. I don't think. I think graduate school in the humanities beats you down as an LDS person so much that it sort of you feel kind of sheepish, or I've described it as feeling like a hermit crab. Is it safe to come out yet? Can I tell people who I am and not get chewed out? That might be overstating it. It's not always that way, but it intellectually it felt that way. It felt like, well, this Mormon thing is an odd thing, but this, I can perform at this, and I do well in my classes, and I write good papers, and they say nice job, and I never mention in my papers, or I never do any kind of effort at integration at all, and it can take decades to recover from that in terms of the kind of scholarship you produce, because you don't feel like you have permission to do it, and you don't even know where to start. I still feel like I'm scrambling. I'm like reading books. Some of the stuff that the Faculty Center has been providing has been really helpful that way. Just that one book that couple, just reading about the state of religion in higher education and seeing the demographics and statistics about religion at the elite universities versus every place else. I mean, that stuff's, I was trained at those elite institutions, and so as far as I knew, everyone in higher education, anyone with a brain on their shoulder, between their shoulders, didn't believe in religion. It took me forever to find anyone who was religious, who was intellectually inclined, except among my Mormon colleagues, So, anyway.
I hope we can continue to.
Yeah.
Well.
Okay, we're done?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Let's go.
All right. Thank you.